everybody, and welcome back to More Than Muse. I'm Stauney.
And I'm Sadie. Happy second week of March. Welcome to the Hysterical Society.
Happy to have you here.
We're so happy to have you here.
And don't forget the merch is on the website. Go check it out. It will be up a little bit longer this time. Understand paychecks coming at different times. Been there. So it's not going to just be merch, but go get it. Wear it with pride. There's lots of options.
I know. We're very proud of it. And today's topic is very long overdue. And I am so excited to be finally talking about it.
I know. I also feel like it's one of those things you hear about your whole life, but you don't really learn about. Like, I knew that they burned witches clear back in elementary school, but I don't think we ever, like, actually sat down and were like,
about it.
This is what happened. It was a good thing to look into for sure.
I know. And it was very interesting to get all that context of it and realize just how crazy some of these things were that happened and how it all just snowballed from one thing, and it's just crazy. So yeah, finally excited to be talking about it.
You know, it's something that I always tie to the Salem witch trials, even though they're technically not related, but the whole Scarlet Letter.
Oh, yes, that makes sense.
Because it's like a Puritan and New England, I think. And then it feels like a witch hunt. Like they completely kick her out of society. So
that's true.
Yeah, just very similar vibes, even though, of course, she wasn't accused of witchcraft.
But it is very much similar vibes of women in a Puritan society and then feeling the wrath of the town around her. So
yeah, and I feel like it's a good basis for kind of what a Puritan society would be like.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we're talking about the Salem witch trials, by the way.
First off, let's just acknowledge the fact that misogyny was indeed a driving force behind the Salem witch trials.
If not the main one.
If not the main one. We'll talk about it more later, but most of the witches were women, actually 78%. And it was interesting to learn, though, that there were actually a couple men that were accused of it as well. I didn't necessarily realize that.
I think it's a good reminder that, like, misogyny doesn't just hurt women. It hurts men, too, because it creates that, like, stereotypical divide that, like, you have to fit into. And if you don't, then you're immediately excluded from everything. Yeah, so, like, men who are different from, like, the stereotypical Puritan man were just as much in danger as the women who weren't. Yeah.
Exactly. And, like, within this very Puritan society, they were across the ocean from their country. This is before America was even a country, 100 years before, really, before 1776. This happens all in the 1600s. So at this point, this is all just like UK colonies of people who have left the UK for different reasons, but a lot of them were religious reasons. And so they created these very tight-knit, very religious communities. And so truly their own hysteria broke out with the worries about the witches.
And, like, it's hard because I'm sure there's so many things that were happening at the time. Like, they were probably terrified in so many ways. And, like, heightened emotion and stress can lead to weird behaviors. Like, hysteria is a thing, mass hysteria. And it does predominantly affect women. And that is something we'll talk about next week, too. Like, more cases of mass hysteria where, like, odd behaviors are contagious and like catch on in weird ways that are unexplainable. So it's fair to assume, new place, new country, like it would make sense that some weird behaviors would happen. But this was the response.
And then this happened.
Like, maybe no, like maybe try something else. That's a little crazy. Yeah.
Of course, you know, that there's a very strict patriarchal society that we talked about. Women are expected to adhere to very strict gender roles, also biblical teachings. Also, like, women who were independent, outspoken. We'll go over some of the specific women later, but like they were generally the ones that were targeted and blamed. And also beyond that, of course, it was xenophobia and even just like social tensions among the groups. Like, some people think that this whole thing started just because there were two feuding families. The town was so on edge, essentially, because like, oh, whose side are you on? So then when all of a sudden the trials started, the witch blaming, everyone was like, like, because the tensions were already so high,
Yeah.
socially.
I think another thing that, like, I have to remind myself of when I think of this is the fact that Puritan beliefs believe in original sin passed on from Adam and Eve, and because of that tale, it's
Mm,
specifically Eve. So they do blame Eve basically for the fall of mankind and, like, the whole idea that Eve was double-edged, like, she
yeah.
disobeyed from the beginning, she's closer to the devil and listened to him, and, like, the
Mhm.
weaker sex more prone to get possessed or overtaken. Like, there's a whole lot of that already there. So then when
Absolutely.
things immediately start going wrong, they're like, "Oh, it's the women." Like, apparently they blamed them for, like, crop failures, economic hardships, like, illness,
Mhm.
anything, like, a lot of stuff was just immediately blamed on
On
women.
the women. With the Salem witch trials, I was surprised that this was really just between February of 1962 and May of 1963. Like, this was actually a very small window.
Mhm.
I thought this was like over the course of 50 years, but no, this was a very specific point, and it all started because of one incident that kind of started the domino effect. But more than 200 people were accused, 30 people were found guilty, which 19 of whom were executed by hanging. 14 of them were women, and 5 of them were men. One of the men actually died under torture after refusing to enter a plea. And then 5 other people passed away just in the jail because it was a very disease ridden
Yeah.
place. So, a very tragic thing that happened here. And again, like, it all happened pretty much within 15 months, it seems. This is a England European colony that is in America at this time. And there were witch trials in Europe, but by the mid 17th
Mhm.
century, apparently, it continued more on the fringes of Europe and in the American colonies. Da, da,
Yeah,
da, da.
actually, I saw a news headline recently that Scotland apparently just came out with a tartan pattern to honor the witches that had died in their
Mm,
history, because they
mm-hmm.
have a different plaid that they do for different families and stuff. So they came
Oh,
out this
cool.
year with one for witches to honor their witch trials that had happened. And I know
Mm-hmm.
there's like a lot of other countries where it happened. I think the reason Salem gets so much heat for it is because it was like a new land fresh from
Yeah.
any recent mistakes. And then the fact that it happened in such a small community
Community.
too.
And also
Yeah.
probably in such a small window of time.
Yes.
It's just so cemented there.
And so many people, more than 200 people accused, 30 people found guilty, 19 hung.
Mm.
That's a lot of people to kill off for witchcraft in the span of a
A
year.
year. In 1668, Joseph Glanville claimed that he could prove the existence of witches and ghosts of the supernatural realm, and he wrote about the denial of the bodily resurrection and the supernatural spirits. Basically, he pretty much claimed that you have to believe in witches because if you don't believe it, then that also means that you don't really believe in Almighty God. And essentially, if God is real, then that must mean demons are real too. So he was basically saying the supernatural can't be denied. So those who did deny apparitions were considered to be heretics. That also he thought disproved their belief in angels. So it's like if there are angels, then I guess that there has to be a counterpart to it. And so that was like the kind of cultural religious context at that time. And then prior to when all of a sudden like the Massachusetts government formed and eventually the America that we now know today, the government had basically been dominated by very conservative Puritan leaders because Puritans and the Church of England, they shared a lot of like common influences, but the Puritans are basically the ones who like came over here and they had built up that community. And so those were the people in clergy, those were the people in places of power within that community. And so it just created a very tight knit religious community. What I thought was
Yeah.
actually interesting is that the earliest recorded witchcraft execution was that of All Young in 1647, actually, in Hartford, Connecticut. And there were like the Connecticut witch trials, which lasted from 1647 to 1663.
Ugh, that's a lot longer.
A lot longer, but they didn't have, I don't think, as many as that Salem witch trials did in that
Mhm.
like 1 year. They were the first like large scale witch trials in the American colonies, happened but 13 years before Salem witch trials. 30
30.
years. Yeah, a total of 30 years before, but there's only 37 cases where and only 11 executions
Okay.
only.
Yeah, but
That's
that's
within the
over.
span of so many years as opposed
Yeah.
to one like basically 1 year in Salem.
Yeah, that's almost 20 years, right?
Mhm. Yeah. A little bit more too about gender. So, obviously, a majority of people accused were women, about 80%. Like you talked about with the original sin and Eve, is that it really was a Puritan belief that women were just inherently sinful and more susceptible to damnation than men were.
Mm.
So beyond just, I'm sure that carried over from Eve, it's oh, so therefore they are more easily to be tempted. Puritan women actively would try to thwart attempts by the devil to overtake them and their souls. Puritans held the belief that men and women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil, and that women's souls were seen as unprotected in their weak and vulnerable bodies. Several factors may explain why women were more likely to admit guilt of witchcraft than men. I'm sure there's a lot of pressuring happening.
Yeah, I'm like,
Uh-huh.
okay, societal pressure, duh.
And also,
Yeah.
like, these women thinking that this is happening. There's a historian named
Yeah.
Elizabeth Rice who said that some likely believed that they had truly given in to the devil, and others might have believed that they had done so temporarily. However,
Mm,
because there were those who confessed who were reintegrated in society, some women might have confessed in order to spare their own lives and things like that,
yeah.
and be like, oh, I'm repentant. Oh, I did, but I'm not anymore, trying to make up for
Well,
that.
honestly, like, how many times would someone, like neighbors, friends, church leaders, family
Hmm.
members, even, how many times would you have to hear someone tell you over and over again, you are a witch, you are a witch, you are a witch, when
Yeah.
you don't have any way to like fact check that? You do believe in the existence
You
of the
believe
devil and
it. Yeah.
witches. How many times would you have to hear that before you would believe it? Like, probably a lot less than any of us want to admit.
Totally. And
Yeah.
especially if you also do believe that you as a woman are more susceptible to the devil
Yeah.
than other people around you. If you think
Yeah.
that's true, I'm sure it's very easy to be like, oh my gosh, maybe I have been deceived.
And especially how many of them were feeling depressed or
Hmm.
anxious or had mental health issues that they didn't know how to diagnose. Like, you would
Yeah.
think, oh my gosh, something is wrong with me. Like, maybe I am possessed, because you wouldn't have any
Hmm.
other explanation for it. Like, there's
True.
so many reasons why it would be like you would probably believe
Like
that something
maybe
had happened to you.
Maybe I am a witch. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, like I mentioned, quarrels with neighbors often would incite these witchcraft. For example, Abigail Faulkner, who was accused in 1692, admitted that she was, quote, angry at what folks said and that the devil may have temporarily overtaking her, causing harm to her neighbors. So that was like a normal thing. It's like if you acted out, if you did something wrong, it was the thing to say, oh, the devil
Yeah.
may have temporarily overtaken
The
me.
devil made me do it.
Exactly. Where's that
Yeah.
phrase come from? And then, of course, like we've already mentioned, that women who did not conform to the norms of Puritan society were more likely to be the
Yeah.
target, especially if they were unmarried or did not have children. Another thing about like how they would publicize witchcraft. So Cotton Mather, who's a minister of Boston's North Church, he was a very prolific publisher of these pamphlets. And he made one where he would express his belief in witchcraft in his book, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcraft and Possessions from 1689. And he describes his oracular observations and how stupendous witchcraft had affected the children of Boston Mason John Goodwin. And he told the story about how the Goodwin's eldest child had been tempted by the devil and had stolen linen from the washerwoman, Goody Glover, who was an Irish woman. Goody Glover was characterized as like a disagreeable old woman and described by her husband as a witch. And so this probably was why she was accused of casting spells on the Goodwin children after he stole their linen. So after
Great.
the event,
Some husband got mad, said, "Oh, my wife is a witch," and
I
then
know.
yeah.
Exactly. So after the event, though, after he stole her linen, 4 out of the 6 Goodwin children began to have strange fits, or what some people refer to as the disease of astonishment. And the manifestations attributed to this disease quickly became associated with witchcraft. And symptoms included the neck and back pains, tongues being drawn out from their throats, and loud, random outcries. Other symptoms would include having no control over their own bodies, such as becoming limber, flapping their arms like birds, or trying to harm others as well as themselves. And these symptoms are what fueled the craze of 1692 and him like publishing this story and accusing perhaps this Goody Glover woman of being a witch and producing these pamphlets. I think it just made people very on edge and like aware of what was happening around them.
Okay.
So,
Also, I'm sorry, but like sticking your tongue out, random outcries, flapping your bodies and going limp on purpose. Have you ever been a kid? Yeah.
yeah, I was like, it does seem to me
And then if one of them got
typical behavior.
attention, like what would the others do? The exact same thing. Yeah. Nowadays, I feel like there's a lot of reasonable. explanations.
Explanations beyond,
Yeah.
"Oh, it's a witch."
So the trials that actually began in Salem happened after a few local women were accused of witchcraft by four young girls. And the four accusers were Betty Paris, who was 9, Abigail Williams, 11, Ann Putnam Jr., 12, and Elizabeth Hubbard, 17. And these accusations centered on the concept of affliction. The women accused of having caused physical and mental harm to the girls through witchcraft. It's sad how young these girls were. They
I
probably did not realize
know.
the effect that this was going to have.
Mhm,
So it was February 1692, and Betty, who was the 9-year-old, and her cousin Abigail, who was 11, were actually the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Parris. Of course, they were related to the Reverend,
mhm.
and began to have fits described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to affect by John Hale, the minister of the nearby town of Beverly. They screamed, threw things around the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under the furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. The girls complained of being pinched and pricked with pins. A doctor couldn't find any physical evidence of any ailment, but then when other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors, they even had a sermon in the Salem village. Like, one of the preachers came and preached as a guest, and there was, like,
Mhm.
several times outbursts by these afflicted people in the town. So it was disrupting their regular lives. And the first 3 people accused and arrested for afflicting Betty, Abigail, Anne, and Elizabeth were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, who's on our shirt.
Mhm.
And some historians believe that the accusation by Ann Putnam Jr. suggests that a family feud may have been the major cause of the witch trials, like you said. At
Mhm.
the time, rivalry was underway between the Putnam and Porter families that polarized the people of Salem and led a lot of the citizens to have really heated debates and even leading into like full-fledged fighting based on their opinions of what was happening in the feud. Do we know what even started this feud?
Ah, it was started as a land dispute.
Oh, of course, to fight over the land.
It says, but it became hotter when it was time for Salem Village to pick a new minister. The Putnams and their camp wanted Rev. Sam Paris, who was a conservative minister who did not tolerate unorthodox views of religion. And I think that the other group wanted somebody different.
Oh,
So,
and that, my friends, is how religion is usually divided and created. You have one group of people who want this guy, one group of people who want that guy, and
and then
congratulations, you now have
they,
2 churches.
or you have the Salem witch trials, apparently.
Yeah, apparently your children get heated and
Hmm.
start accusing your neighbors of witchcraft. Sarah Good was a destitute woman who was accused of witchcraft because of her reputation. She was accused of rejecting Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline when she chose to torment and scorn children instead of leading them towards the path of salvation. So that doesn't sound biased at all. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church meetings, oh the horror, and was accused of witchcraft because the Puritans believed that she had her own self interests in mind following her remarriage to an indentured servant.
Oh.
And the citizens of the town, of course, disapproved of her trying to control her son's inheritance from her previous marriage. And then Tituba was an enslaved South American Kalina woman from the West Indies who became a target because obviously her race.
Yeah.
And she was accused of attracting girls like Abigail and Betty with stories of enchantment from this book called Melissa. I'm going to say it wrong. Melissus Maleficarum. It's called Hammer of Witches. And it actually talks about witchcraft from a German Catholic
Mm.
clergyman, originally published in Germany in the 14th century. And they said it's basically like early demonology from the Roman
Mhm.
Catholic Church position. A spooky little book, but also religious.
Was just gonna say.
Yeah, like nothing really insane about that. If you
Mhm.
believe in religious texts, then it shouldn't have been a problem. But these tales about sexual encounters with demons, swaying the minds of men, and fortune telling were said to stimulate the imaginations of girls and made Tituba an obvious target for accusations. But I don't know, swaying the minds of men.
Could be worse things.
Yeah. Plus, they told their kids fairy tales, I'm sure, all the time. Try not to judge them too harshly, but I judge them. The allegedly afflicted girls were said to have been entertained by Paris's slave Tituba multiple times with these stories, and various secondary sources, starting with Charles Upham in the 19th century, relate that a circle of girls with Tituba's help tried their hands at fortune telling. regular girl stuff.
Of
They
course.
used the white of an egg and a mirror to create a primitive crystal ball to divine the professions of their future spouses and scared one another when one supposedly saw the shape of a coffin instead. We did
Ooh.
MASH. They did that.
Yeah, you know what? This sounds like girlhood to
I
me.
know. Fortune telling, 100%. That was my
Mhm.
entire childhood. This story is drawn from John Hill's book about the trials, but in his account, only one of the girls had confessed to him afterward that she had once tried this. So we don't even know if it was
Mhm.
more than just one girl. Hale also didn't mention Tatuba as having any part of it, nor did he identify when the incident took place, but the record of her pretrial examination holds her giving an energetic confession, speaking before the court of creatures who inhabit the invisible world, the dark rituals which bind them together in the service of Satan, implicating both Good and Osborne while asserting that many other people in the colony were engaged in the devil's conspiracy against the Bay.
Whoa.
Honestly, so I think that her race has a lot to even do with her statements because she was described in later accounts as Caribbean Indian or African descent, or some contemporary sources describe her only as Indian, which I think is why a lot of the sources I saw then claimed she was Native American. But a lot of more like indigenous
Yes.
culture there,
Mhm.
even if it's like the West Indies. And there is some like research that suggests that maybe she was captured in Venezuela, brought to Barbados, and then may have been, because of that, an Arawak Indian. Or I guess some people described her as a Spanish Indian, which could mean a Native American from Carolinas, Georgia, Florida. But even looking at any of those cultures, they
Mhm.
believe in like the existence of spirits and demons and everything like in a much more present way than even the Puritans did. So
Mhm.
like it's not that crazy of her probably to tell children stories of this and warn them against things. Like it would be a very normal thing
Mhm.
in her culture. Like even her confessing to that, I'm like, okay, so she was passing on the tales of like her
Mhm.
culture to these girls. There's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, each of these women was an outcast, like we said, destitute, didn't go to church, or even just a different race, and exhibited many of the characters' traits typical of the usual suspects for witchcraft accusation. So,
Mhm.
people we don't like. They were left to defend themselves and brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft. They were interrogated for several days, starting on March 1st of 1692, and then sent to jail. In March, well, it's so fitting we're doing this in March.
Just in time.
Others were accused of witchcraft, including Martha Corey, her daughter Dorothy, or not her daughter, but a
Sarah
child.
Goods. Yeah.
Yeah, Dorothy Good and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Village, and then Rachel Clinton in nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey had expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations and thus drawn attention. So I guess her saying, I'm not sure if these girls are right, was enough to then accuse her of witchcraft.
Yep.
And then the charges against her and Rebecca Nurse deeply troubled the community because Martha was a full covenanted member of the church in Salem Village, as was Rebecca Nurse in the church in Salem town. And then they started to think if such upstanding people could be witches, then anyone could be a witch. And the
Mhm.
church membership wasn't a protection from accusation. And then you have Dorothy Good, who is the daughter of Sarah Good, was only 4 years old, but didn't get exempt from the questioning either. And then her answers were construed as a confession that implicated her mother, a
A
4 year old,
4-year-old.
was
Yeah,
put
it's
on trial for
crazy.
witchcraft. And then in Ipswich, Rachel Clinton was arrested for witchcraft and at the end of March on independent charges unrelated to the afflictions of the girls in Salem Village, but because of witchcraft. Warrants were issued for more people, and then Sarah Osborne, who was one of the first three persons accused, died in jail on May
Mhm.
10th, 1692.
One thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if I copied it over, but
Mm-hmm.
I was reading that Dorothy Good, she was in jail until October. Like they held her there for I
The
think
4 year old?
the 4-year-old for 6 months until they let her go.
Oh my gosh. Nowadays, can you even incarcerate a 4 year old?
No, you absolutely cannot.
I'm like, is that even legal? There's no
No.
way. What would a 4 year old have done that would send them to jail? That
Yeah,
is
she was
crazy.
in jail and then I think someone maybe finally posted a bail for the 4-year-old. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but she was in there for months. And I don't know like what this situation or circumstance was or how they took care of her, but
That's absolutely
she was
ridiculous. And
technically
the fact that she was what,
held.
the only like the seventh person accused? So it only
Yeah.
took them like six people before they were like, this 4 year old is
Yeah,
guilty.
I know. And it's hard too because it's like But she admitted to it. And it's like, yeah, because she's 4.
Yeah,
Like,
I
what do
know. Be
you
like,
mean?
you can get a 4-year-old to pretty much admit to anything. You ask
Yeah.
my 2-year-old nephew if he's a dog, and he's, yes,
Yeah,
100%. Like,
absolutely, I'm a dog. Exactly.
it's just ridiculous. Oh, how fast that escalates. It's so crazy. So then warrants started being issued for 36 more people, with examinations continuing to take place in Salem. Cotton Mather wrote to one of the judges, John Richards, a member of his congregation, on May 31st, 1692, expressing his support for the prosecutions, but then cautioning them, do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of persons not only innocent, but also very virtuous. Though I believe that the just God then ordinarily provides a way for the speedy vindication of the persons then abused. That's like saying nothing.
I know. He's pretty much, whoa, let's not fully go for evidence because there's good
Yeah.
people in there.
But then God will provide a way for them to be vindicated
If they're
if.
really not witches,
And
then
I'm like,
yeah,
which
exactly.
doesn't happen, by the way. Fully believe in God, but I know that many innocent people in jail.
Yeah.
That is not always the case, sir.
Hmm.
The Court of Oyer and Terminer convened in Salem town on June 2nd in 1692, with William Staunton, the new lieutenant governor, as chief magistrate, Thomas Newton as the Crown's attorney prosecuting the cases, and Stephen Sewell as a clerk. Bridget Bishop's case was the first brought to the grand jury, who endorsed all the indictments against her, and she was described as not living a Puritan lifestyle, for she wore black clothing and odd costumes, which were against the
Hmm.
Puritan code, so her wardrobe got her convicted.
Yep.
When she was examined before her trial, Bishop was asked about her coat, which had been awkwardly cut or torn in 2 ways. She tore her coat and got
Yeah,
accused of being a
imagine
witch.
getting like stuck on a branch and suddenly you're on trial for it.
And they're like, you wear
Also,
black.
is Bridget Bishop like the original emo girl? Because what is more
Maybe.
emo than wearing so much black that the town assumes that you're a
Yeah,
witch?
literally. They're like, you wear so much black that you have to be a witch.
And her odd costumes.
Never mind the fact, how many clothing choices did they even have?
But I'm wondering,
It's not like they had that many colors to pick from.
truly. Yeah.
Oh gosh. This along with her immoral lifestyle, which, to remind you, when anytime we mention immoral lifestyle, that literally just means they didn't attend church every week, pretty much,
Or
right?
in this situation, wearing black and odd costumes, which is against Puritan code.
Yeah.
Who
Oh my
knows
gosh.
if that's all that it was, but I'm sure, yes, this immoral lifestyle
Mhm.
was nothing, actually.
So she affirmed to this because of her immoral lifestyle and all of the black clothing and everything. The jury was like, yep, she's a witch. And so she
Hmm.
went to trial the same day and was convicted. And then on June 3rd, the grand jury endorsed indictments against Rebecca Nurse and John Willard, but they didn't go to trial immediately, which they're not really sure why in that case. But then Bridget Bishop was executed by hanging on June 10th, 1692. So she literally got hung for black clothing and a torn coat. From June 30th through July, grand juries endorsed indictments against Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Proctor, which her name's really famous,
Hmm.
John Proctor, Martha Carrier, Sarah Wilds, and Dorcas Horde. Along with Rebecca Nurse, all went to trial at this time, where they were found guilty, and all 5 of them were executed by hanging on July 19th, 1692. In August, grand juries indicted George Burroughs, Mara Eastley, Martha Corey, and George Jacob Sr. Trial juries convicted Martha Carrier, George Jacob Sr., John Burroughs, John Willard, Elizabeth Proctor, and John Proctor. Elizabeth was given a temporary stay of execution because she was pregnant.
Isn't that crazy?
But her husband, Martha, George, John, and John Proctor were all executed. So they were like, we'll let you wait until you have the baby and then we'll raise your orphan.
That's the crazy. It's so crazy.
Oh my
Like that was their
gosh.
grand plan.
Yeah, I guess. They're like, you're pregnant. We'll let you have the baby first and then we'll
We're not
execute you.
gonna kill a baby. We're gonna kill you, but not the baby. We're gonna
It's
wait till it's 4 years
ridiculous.
old to
Yes, and
accuse
then
it
we'll
of
throw
being
it
a
in
witch.
jail. And
Then we'll
because it
put
was
it in
born of 2 witches, how could it not be a witch? I don't understand the
literally.
logic.
Like, you would think that would be the
Oh
conclusion.
my. In September, grand juries indicted 18 more people, but they failed to indict William Proctor, who was rearrested on new charges. On September 19th, 1692, Giles Corey refused to plead at trial and was killed by pianoforte adder, which is when a subject is pressed beneath an increasingly heavy load of stones in order to make him enter a plea. So
Also,
literally tortured.
apparently he was like 80 years old. Like, he was an old man. That's why it killed him, because he was old.
That
He
is
didn't stand a
insane.
chance. It's very sad.
Oh gosh. And they're like, here, we'll torture you until you tell the truth. Like, that's not confession under duress.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. 4 pleaded guilty and 11 others were tried and found guilty. On October 29th, Judge Sewell wrote, the Court of Oyer and Terminer count themselves thereby dismissed. Asked whether the Court of Oyer and Terminer should sit, expressing some fear of inconvenience by its fall, the governor said it must fall. Perhaps by coincidence, Governor Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was among those who had been called out upon around this time. And after this order, there were no more executions. So it literally took the governor's wife getting accused of witchcraft for him to shut this crap
He'd be
down.
like, no, no
He's like,
more.
my wife is not a witch. Let's stop all of this
Mm.
nonsense.
Yep. I thought it was so crazy. That's what stopped it.
Well, of course. It
Yeah, of
wasn't
course.
personal until...
It
Isn't
was
that what they're
personal.
saying nowadays? They're like,
Mhm.
oh, you don't think that we need this until all of a sudden your wife does, your mom does, your sister does. And then all of a sudden,
And then you realize this is ridiculous. Yes.
it's just crazy.
So we've already touched on some of these legal procedures, but basically, so after someone concluded that a loss, illness, or a death had been caused by witchcraft, which, like, they can just maybe decide that for themselves if it's happened.
Well, I'm just like, that's the craziest thing ever. Like, you're sitting in your house normally, your kid catches a cold, and all of a sudden you're a witch. Like,
or like a witch did this, and I think it was them because they got in a fight. Like, my son stole their, whatever, and I
yeah,
bet they're mad at them.
just
now.
literally anything they could blame
Mhm.
them for witchcraft because there's no actual like definition or justification to call anyone a witch. We don't know what that means.
Exactly.
They were flying on a broom, so
Mhm.
there's just no way to actually have proof that anyone was engaging in witchcraft.
Exactly. But the accuser could enter a complaint against the alleged witch with a local magistrate, and if the complaint was deemed credible, the magistrate had the person arrested and brought in for a public examination, which was like basically an interrogation where the magistrate pressed the accused to confess. If the magistrate at this local level was satisfied that the complaint was well-founded, the prisoner was handed over to be dealt with by a superior court. In 1692, the magistrates opted to wait for the arrival of the new charter and governor, who would establish that a court oyer and terminer to handle these cases. The next step at the superior court level was to summon witnesses before the grand jury, and then a person could be inducted on charges of afflicting with witchcraft or making an unlawful covenant with the devil. Once indicted, the defendant went to trial, sometimes on the same day. As in the case of the first person indicted and tried on June 2nd, which was Bridget Bishop, who you have already talked about, who was executed only 8 days later. There were 4 total execution dates, 1 person on June 10th, 5 on July 19th, Sarah, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds, 5 on August 19th, Martha Carrier, John Willard, George Burroughs, George Jacobs, and John Proctor, and then 8 on September 22nd of 1692, which is Mary Easty, Martha Corey, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. There was actually 2 women that were convicted but given temporary reprieves because they were pregnant. Thank goodness for them that the governor stepped in and said no more. And then 5 other were convicted, but the death sentence was never carried out.
It says Mary Bradbury was convicted when she wasn't there, I guess.
She was gone.
Yeah,
One of them
Foster
died in prison.
and then Mary Lancey Sr., Foster's
Dorcas
daughter,
Hoare and Abigail Hobbs.
And I'm assuming they were probably saved because of the governor's order after that.
I have 2. Another really sad thing is that because they were convicted witches, like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, they'd been excommunicated from their churches, so therefore they were denied proper burials. So as soon as the bodies of these accused were cut down from the trees, they were thrown into a very shallow grave. And like, I just think that's really sad. That's another part of this, is that like even in death, because the church no longer had them in their congregation, they weren't properly put to rest. But there is some like oral history claims that the families of the dead reclaimed their bodies after dark and buried them in unmarked graves on family
I hope
property.
so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's no really record of this. It's just something that's been going on that was told.
That's so sad in so many ways. Like, it almost makes the whole jury judge system feel like a mockery. Because,
Totally.
like, what was the point of putting them all through a trial if you were going to accuse them of something like this and even having a jury of their peers if this was the outcome? Like, they might as well
Yeah.
have just taken them and killed them immediately, basically.
Yeah,
Because it wasn't
absolutely.
a fair trial. They didn't, like, even give them a chance.
Mm-mm.
Like, the whole thing's, it feels like a facade to make them feel better about the fact that they were doing it. They're like, we put them on trial. And it's, no, you didn't.
No, you didn't.
That's not a fair trial.
One thing, so what the spectral evidence that we hinted at before, pretty much most of the evidence used against the accused was this spectral evidence or the testimony of the afflicted who claimed to see the apparition or the shape of the person who was allegedly afflicting them. So it's saying like they saw the spirit. So the theological dispute that ensued about the use of this evidence was based on whether a person had to give permission to the devil for his or her shape to be used to afflict. Opponents claim that the devil was able to use anyone's shape to afflict people, but the court contended that the devil could not use a person's shape without that person's permission. Therefore, when the afflicted claimed to see the apparition of a specific person, that was accepted as evidence that the accused had been complicit with the devil. So they decided that, okay, if they saw this, that meant that you had obviously said yes to the devil. So that's probably why they were like, oh, it's because she's wearing black clothing. That's why.
Yeah, obviously.
This is another disgusting thing. So, a witch cake. According to March 27th, 1692 entry by Paris in the records of the Salem Village Church, a church member and close friend and neighbor of Reverend Paris, Mary Sibley, who was the aunt of Mary Walcott, directed John Indian, a man that was actually enslaved by Paris, to make a witch cake that may have been a superstitious attempt to ward off evil spirits. And basically, what happened is that this cake is a means to discover witchcraft, and it was made from rye and urine from the afflicted girls and was fed to a dog.
How does that discover witchcraft?
Heck if I know, but apparently it was going to help ward off the witches. If they peed on the witch cake made out of rye meal and the dog.
With everything we've covered so far,
why not?
That sounds the most like witchcraft.
That is so true. Yes. Another thing was the touch test. So basically, this was used in Andover during preliminary examinations in September of 1692. So Reverend Paris had explicitly warned his congregations against these examinations, but I'm sure like it was like in their minds. But basically what it was is if the accused witch touched the victim while the victim was having a fit and the fit stopped, observers believed that meant the accused was the person who had afflicted the victim. Several of those accused later recounted, quote, "We were blindfolded and our hands were laid upon the afflicted persons. They being in their fits and falling into their fits at our coming into their presence, as they said. Some led us and laid our hands upon them, and then they said they were well and that we were guilty of afflicting them. Whereupon we were all seized as prisoners by a warrant from the justice of the peace and forthwith carried to Salem." Which, to me, it seems like they should be blindfolding the people who are afflicted, not blindfolding the witches.
Oh, yeah, seriously. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. This person who accused you of witchcraft then says that you're the person who afflicted them?
Crazy.
Wow, that must be true.
What must be true. Reverend John Hale explained how this supposedly worked. Quote, "The witch, cast by the cast of her eye, sends forth a malefic venom into the bewitched to cast him into a fit, and therefore the touch of the hand doth by sympathy cause that venom to return into the body of the witch again."
Or the accuser pretends to be having a fit until the person they accused of witchcraft comes up and touches them, and then they're like, "Oh, no, I'm fine. You did it."
I'm fine now. The fact that it was not seen, like, no, this could be so much more foolproof if only you blindfold both parties.
Yes, and then have them line up and each person go through and then have them see which one they react to.
Exactly.
Maybe we should have been running these trials.
If we had been there, we could have saved them all.
No one would have died. I can promise
Nobody
you
would have
that.
died.
However, they probably would kill us.
Yeah, we would be the witches.
Yeah. They're like, what the heck is wrong with you?
Literally.
Okay, so even though the last trial was held in May of 1693, public response to these events continued. In the decades following the trials, survivors and family members and their supporters sought to establish the innocence of the individuals who were convicted and to gain compensation. In the following centuries, the descendants of those unjustly accused and condemned have sought to honor their memories. Events in Salem and Danvers in 1992 were used to commemorate the trials, and in November 2001, years after the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the trials, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act exonerating all who had been convicted and naming each of the innocent. I'm so sorry, but it took over 300 years for anyone to officially say, oh, by the way, these women and
We
men
don't
weren't
think
witches.
yeah, it's crazy. There are, you'll talk about it in a second. There are some
Yeah.
instances a couple years later where it's like,
Mhm.
okay, they did some of it, but even
still,
still.
for like the Massachusetts legislature, it reminds me of like how there was a law in Missouri that like people could legally kill Mormons up until 20 years ago. That's the
Yeah.
legacy of my ancestors.
Yeah, literally. Get out of Missouri,
Yeah.
guys.
And
You
then
don't
someone
know.
was reading it and they were like, oh, this is really bad. Someone could use this as a loophole for some really crazy stuff. And they were like, oh, shoot. Yeah, we don't believe in religious persecution.
We should not say you can kill people.
So that's really fun. Okay, so they obviously exonerated all of them except for Elizabeth Johnson, who was cleared by the Massachusetts Senate on May 26, 2002.
Why would they do everyone but her?
Her?
Like, how
I
did
don't
that get
know.
missed?
The craziest part to me is that it was the last conviction to be reversed because of pressure from school children who discovered the anomaly. They were like, hey, by the way, you missed one person.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then they were like, oh,
Oh,
sorry about
yeah, I
that.
heard Elizabeth too.
Yes.
Sorry.
Also, a note on that, like, Tituba disappeared completely from record. Like, apparently she spent over a year in jail, but the reason we don't have anything else about her
Mhm.
because she
Just
was
wasn't even
not
on record.
indicted. She was released at some point, but then she completely disappeared from the historical record. And to be
Weird.
honest, like, maybe it's just really, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being really, like, pessimistic, but I would assume that they probably just killed her without a jury
Mm,
trial, especially because she confessed. I don't really see them letting her walk free
totally.
after that
Yeah.
unless they just kicked her out. I don't know, because it's completely unknown what happened to her. And I don't think it was reversed for her either, and she was declared innocent because she never had like an official
She never
jury conviction.
technically been convicted. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's even sketchier. She just completely disappeared from record. A little freaky. On October 17th, 1711, the General Court did pass a bill reversing the judgment against the 22 people listed on the 1709 petition. There were apparently 7 additional people who'd been convicted but had not signed the petition, but there was no reversal of obtainer for them. And then 2 months later, on December of 1711, the Governor Dudley authorized monetary compensation to the 22 people from that 1709 petition. And so they were given 578 pounds.
I think it was 578 that was authorized to
Okay.
be divided among the survivors and relatives of those accused, which, like,
Mhm.
578 pounds in 1711.
I mean, it was probably a lot. But like also at
But,
the
like,
same
that
time,
doesn't go away. That doesn't help
yeah.
anything. Yeah.
I'm like, oh, sorry, we wrongly accused your grandma of being a witch and then killed her and threw her in a shallow grave. Here's some
Here,
money.
yeah, 20 of you, split this.
Just ridiculous. So it was divided among the survivors and relatives. Most accounts were settled within a year, but Philip English's extensive claims were not settled until 1718. Finally, in March of 1712, Reverend Nicholas Noyes and members of the Salem Church reversed Noyes' earlier excommunications of Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey, so they officially weren't excommunicated anymore. And not all of the condemned had been exonerated in the early 18th century. In 1957, descendants of the 6 people who'd been wrongly convicted and executed but had not been included in the bill for the reversal in 1711 or added 1712 demanded that the General Court formally clear the names of their ancestral family members. When the act was passed pronouncing the innocence of those accused, it listed only Anne Pewter by name. And then the others were just listed as certain other people, which failed to specifically name Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin, Alice Parker, Wilmot Reed, and Margaret Scott, which is so dumb to just be like, oh yeah, this lady and whoever else we forgot.
Yeah. Take 2 more seconds. Write their names down.
I'm like, you had trials. It's obviously all recorded. So yeah, that's what you said about like they tried a few times to make amends for this, but it wasn't until like we're all officially pardoned by the
Apparently
government.
until 3 years ago, until they finally got the last one officially.
Yeah, which I'm like, come on. There are some memorials. Rebecca Nurse's descendants did erect an obelisk-shaped granite memorial in her memory in 1885 on the grounds of Nurse Homestead in Danvers, with an inscription from John Greenleaf Whittier. And then in 1892, an additional monument was erected in honor of 40 neighbors who signed a petition in honor of her.
For one thing, at least the Salem witch trials, it's very universally known that these women
100%.
and these people were so falsely accused. It's become a place that people go visit. I've never, of course, myself, but
I haven't either. I actually would really love to go.
I've heard it's crazy to go during Halloween season, which makes
yeah, in a way, I feel like that is, I don't know, like maybe they would be offended by it, but I do feel like it's a nice way to honor them.
Totally.
In a way to be like, to make it a huge event for Halloween and talk about the Salem witches and everything, even
like,
though,
I think that, yeah, I think in a way it's a good thing that it hasn't been forgotten.
Yeah,
if anything,
like,
just
even
because
if it's
like kitschy almost.
yeah. And like, I know it's like maybe in poor taste a little bit or something, but like at least they're being talked about in like a huge way at least once a year. So
like we said, it's universally known that it was ridiculous that this shouldn't have happened. A quick little note about what perhaps the medical theories, like what was causing those girls to act that way.
Oh, 1 second before we get into that. I just saw a thing that like other evidence that allowed them to be accused was discovery of books of palmistry and horoscopes.
Oh, yeah.
If they had like pots of ointments in their possession or in the home of the accused, or what they called witches' teats, which were basically like a mole or a blemish somewhere on the body that was insensitive to touch.
Yes,
So like you have a mole and like they touch it and nothing happens, then I guess they're like, oh, you're a witch, it's a witch's mark.
Yeah.
And yeah, so those were the evidence of things that they were killing people for.
Crazy.
And yeah, that and a cake made of urine, I guess. Anyway, continue.
Literally, the cake made of urine. I could die. You're right. That's the most witchcraft thing I've heard.
Literally, out of everything we've read, wearing black, telling fortunes with egg whites. I'm like, okay, whatever. And then
they're like, ooh, rye and pee on this and now let the dog eat it.
Yes, that is way witchier than any the other people did.
Exactly. Okay, so the cause of the symptoms of those who claimed affliction is obviously still debated. We don't know for sure, but there's a lot of different theories. Of course, psychological hysteria. Oh, this is the thing that like could be physically wrong. So it's called conclusive ergotism caused by eating rye bread made from grain infected by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which is a natural substance from which LSD is derived. So they maybe think that some of these girls had some bread that was infected by this fungus, which did cause them to probably legitimately act out very strangely, considering what now LSD is. So that's very possible. There's also an epidemic of bird bone anaphyllitis, lethargica, sleep paralysis to explain the nocturnal attacks alleged by some of the accusers. But it could also just be not even biological at all and just said that the motivations were jealousy, spite, and a need of attention.
Yeah.
Which honestly, could be all of the above.
Yeah. No, I think it's crazy. And like, it's also very, if you want to compare like a modern day witch hunt in a lot of ways, you could talk about the satanic panic of the 80s.
Yeah.
And just like people freaking out about like heavy metal bands and thinking that all their teenagers playing Dungeons and Dragons were possessed by the devil. And it just led into this insane thing where like people actually got thrown in prison. There was a couple who were running a preschool, and I don't even know how it happened, but like the kids were basically forced or like pressured into making confessions about these strange things, like being kept in dog cages and like anything that they could come up with out of their little minds. And then they
Mhm.
ended up throwing people in prison for torture and satanic activity in the 80s that, like, they were completely innocent of, and then the charges
Mhm.
had to be reversed. This is not the only time in history that this has happened. I think it's
No.
just to this extent and for just and so, like, gender specific as well with the
Yes.
Salem witch trials.
And it's just
Yeah,
a
just a big
direct thing of, "Oh, these women are different than us.
kill
Must
them.
be a witch. I don't like her.
Yeah,
I think she's making me act funny. Flail my arms around a bit."
just absolutely insane, but
But anyway,
that's
like we
that's the Salem
said,
witch trial.
it's nice that eventually efforts were made to make sure that on record they have been cleared of their non-crimes. And yeah, like I said, our merch even this month is honoring one of those Salem witch trials. So you want to know what I almost hope? I hope it's all true. I hope that they were witches and there were demons going around Salem and that actually is true. I'm sure there's probably movies out there with that spin
Oh,
on that
literally,
actually there were the
um,
Salem witches.
The Witch with Anna Taylor-Joy,
Yes.
spelled like the Vivitch or whatever, that is set in this time period. It's a puritanical family that gets ousted from their society for being too religious. Like, they were to the extreme.
Oh.
And so they're like, "Go live on your own, you're insane." And then she's, like, the daughter in the family, and they slowly all because of, like, starvation and pressure and everything else, they end up accusing their daughter of witchcraft. And in the end, like, it ends up being all true, and that would be nicer, but
That would
honestly, I
be
just
but
don't
here's the
have
thing,
that
I'm
much faith in
not
people.
no, and I'm not saying that they even did anything wrong by being
Yeah,
witches.
no.
Let them be witches.
Let them be witches, let them do whatever they want. Who
Yeah.
cares? That's another thing that's just so insane. I'm like, "Okay." Like
And
the
what about
horoscope
it?
books or if it's just, "Oh, goodness gracious, religious freedom, people, it's what you left England for."
Yeah,
Let them do
exactly.
whatever they want. No, also, like, Mad Woman by Taylor Swift is 100% written about
Mhm.
the witch trials in any form. She also has, like,
Or
the phrase, "Women like hunting witches too during your dirtiest work for you. It's obvious that wanting me dead has really brought you two together," which is, like, very fitting of strange motives causing weird accusations and the fact that
yep.
women will turn on other women in times like this when
Mhm.
it's not deserved.
Also, the lyric, "When it's burned the bitch, they're shrinking. When the truth comes out, it's quiet."
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the minute the governor was like, "Let's stop killing people," and all of a sudden everyone was just like, "Okay.
Noted. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry, we don't wanna take accountability for the fact that we've just killed 200 people."
Anyways, thank you for joining us for another week of March Madness. I hope that we gave you something to be mad about. That's truly what we're doing this
Mhm.
month is giving you plenty of things to be angry about. And we'll be back next week with more thoughts on mass hysteria and it's going to be a fun thing to talk about, I
Oh,
will admit.
yes. We are diving so deep into mass hysteria this year, you guys. I'm so
Mhm.
excited. If you wanna go back and hear more about, like, historical things and everything of hysteria, we have a lot of episodes on that, especially from last year, of, like, mental
Mhm.
health of women and everything. But I'm very excited to talk about mass hysteria this year because what the
And
heck?
it's going
And
to be
it's still,
fun.
like, unsolved, like, we don't know.
Yep.
So, yeah, it'll be a good time.
If you're new to the podcast, come say hi on Instagram, Substack,
Mhm.
YouTube. We do visual episodes. Leave a rating or review in celebration of Women's History Month, and we'll see you back next week.
And don't forget to check out the merch on
Boom.
morethanmusedpodcast.com.
More than
Okay.
musepodcast.com. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.